So, welcome to the Arbeitspanel 2, Thinking Aesthetic Thinking through Aesthetic Research Practices. Thank you so much for joining this section. I'm Arteaga. Since 2019, we, four artistic researchers, Emma Cocker, Nicole, Wendel, Sabine, Zahn, and me, have been working together intensively within a series of exploratory sessions or even laboratories, inquiring through specific aesthetic practices, the concept, the performance, and conditions of and for aesthetic thinking. We would like to share with you today what we call an ecology of aesthetic research practices, a set of interconnected aesthetic practices in action. Our aim is to provide conditions for evidence of what aesthetic thinking might be. After this ecology in action, which will take approximately 70 minutes, we invite you to engage in a dialogue with us. We have certain recommendations for you to engage with this ecology of research practices. We would like to ask you to use full screen. If it does not happen automatically, please change your view option to speaker mode. Your video and audio will remain muted and will be activated only for the dialogue. Please refrain from using the chat function until the dialogue begins. We are very much looking forward to engaging in a conversation with you later. Aesthetic thinking as a concept to approach the relationships between aesthetic and erkenntnis, focusing thus on a process that integrates constitutively the sensible and the cognitive transformation of what appears, firstly and fundamentally, through specific mobilizations of the sensuous, transforming appearances through interventions in the conditions of and for them to appear, intervening thus in a flow of emergence of sense through the same kind of actions, aesthetic actions, that trigger a particular modulation of this process, a modulation that allows for qualifying it as aesthetic sense-making. Thinking aesthetic thinking through aesthetic research practices, a set of systemic connection between aesthetic actions in action, an ecology of aesthetic research practices, as a dispositive for thinking the action's own transformative agencies. Thinking collectively, aesthetic thinking as providing conditions for the emergence of evidence of these cognitive agencies and, simultaneously, as a framework to inhabit the evidences that might emerge. Thinking aesthetic thinking through aesthetic research practices as a process of destabilization of sedimented meanings of thinking, of aesthetics, and of the ways they may relate to one another in order to disclose other possible but not yet accessible intelligibilities. Common,
moving,
work,
disappearance,
eyes,
sensation,
engagement,
fluid,
continuity,
ingrained,
quality,
sliding,
carried,
enter,
walking, breeze,
relax, gentleness,
think,
choosing, continuously moving, accepting what there is to move on.
This witness mode is also possible with language, with a certain mobilization of this medium, language.
Something to do with the capacity to be moving the body, or this movement between movement and stillness.
Again, wondering how this spaciousness comes. This feeling of spaciousness comes through relating to a perception of how things are together.
It was really a physical sensation turning into an image ingrained in my skin.
To keep the fundamental continuity of the mode of being and not go into another rigidity, another functionality, another operability.
This correspondence between language and the I.
And what does it mean to think with the stone?
There are alternatives to that. What is an aesthetic use of language?
An impulse to move. The smell suddenly activated a really different kind of stillness, a much less self-conscious stillness.
What if when we move to the medium of language, what if we begin to act within the medium of language, continuing doing the same?
Let words appear without the intention of grasping something, but rather creating or reinforcing or realizing an object of perception in language.
The question of touching, of the with, bring it forth through or better with language.
Present, but not in a reaching way.
The skin experience of the body felt important or dominant. It did not feel important, it felt dominant.
Not forcing language to be a grasping tool, but a touching tool.
What is this becoming aware of? Coming, connecting with, getting in touch with? What is this moment of happening where do I shift then, and where is the shift happening?
Periphery.
Momentum.
Background.
Continue.
Shifting.
Touching.
Removal.
Allow.
Collapse.
Impulse.
Fluidity.
Material.
Reaching.
All these nameless situations or moments that are not graspable yet and that need a different navigation in order to be communicated.
Begin to write, produce articulated signs, touching the stone.
It also felt like a feeling of moving into things. It is a different kind of choosing.
Not now and not before. I was never looking at an object, because you can listen to someone who is silent, to bring that attitude of listening to the stone as well. Listening to the muteness, and it was not silent.
There was this feeling of moving into things one after another. A different kind of choosing, continuously moving, accepting what is there to move on.
I notice these moments of disorientation. I appreciate these in-between zones of being oriented and being disoriented. There are movements happening, a kind of stretching out.
Language unfolding from that experience in the same key or texture as the experience. This language with, thinking with, unfolding.
This kind of shimmering on my retina. I noticed those floating shapes that you get on the surface of the eye. And I became interested in this as the proximate sphere, or as the edge of the body in a way.
This kind of lively lightness, a quality of lightness. Again, the flight of thought, a sense of when you notice it going into thought. Does it really have to go into thought?
Reciprocity.
Following.
Recognizing.
Mutuality.
Muteness.
Bend.
Third space.
Before.
Present.
Deeply.
Parts.
Capacity.
Indirectness.
Resonating. Coincidence.
There is this liminal sense, almost an out of timeness in a way.
There is something of a quality of support in the action that enabled a sense of thinking.
It felt as a cognitive operation, but not as a linguistic operation.
The indirectness of this kind of thinking.
To bring up from under and to carry over. This is a condition of a certain kind of thinking.
How to enter. The question really, how to enter. Entering into what?
Am I really thinking with the stone, or am I thinking about the stone? What it means to think with the stone.
This dual relationship between activating a certain level of sensitivity or sensibility, and at the same time knocking back the wider sense of awareness, a kind of yes, no quality to the practice.
I am struck by the kind of interweaving of emergence between the different parts, a coming together, but not through association.
This witness mode might be easier in the medium of a touching body.
Highly present, highly sensory engagement, but at the same time keeping it contained within a certain sphere of experience in a way. This liminal sense, almost an out of timeness.
The preconditions for exploring was establishing a sense of comfort. What seemed to emerge was this interplay between a sense of orientation and a sense of disorientation. And it seemed that it was in the movement between orientation and disorientation that the movement of curiosity began to arise in a way.
What is this mouth and this tongue forming? The stone is so concrete, so materialized, and so dense.
A merging of felt or even physical, rhythmical qualities that intrigue one another, So things start to swing with one another, begin to swing.
Dive.
Descend.
Coincidence.
Necessity.
Shimmering.
Realize.
Pleasure.
Letting. Looking.
Mediating.
Expand.
Intention.
Reading.
It was not introspective. So it stayed local to the body, very proximate to the body, but there was no tendency to introspect. It stayed near, but not going into.
Not now and not before. I was never looking at an object.
It was almost like being held within a certain fluid atmosphere, allowing the distraction part of the environment to be sort of held back. Really a contradictory sense of feeling deeply, feeling connected to the environment.
This mutual emergence, each creating the conditions for the other.
This is
Listening
expressed.
to the muteness, and it was not silent.
This is expressed as a way of saying not being distracted by everything that is happening, but rather being contained or even protected from distractions.
The chronological aspect of cause and effect felt complicated, more like a web of relations.
Ground.
Giving.
Spaciousness.
Pleasure.
Activity.
Conditioning.
Again.
Deepens.
Appear.
Allow.
Again. Sustained.
Yourself.
Resonating.
How to enter. The question really, how to enter. Entering into what?
Slip into.
It happens again and again and again, and it deepens. It helps to. It happens. And the circling around.
The territory of the paper, the continuity of space, or where is the space actually happening?
The removal of something or the shifting of something that suddenly brings the background into the fore, or the periphery somehow into a more focused attention.
It is a common, which is not at the beginning there, a common which is happening.
How big it can expand.
It is an unknown common.
carried or taken or moved by a momentum that I am not fully in control of somehow, like a breeze.
Again, wondering how this spaciousness comes. This feeling of spaciousness comes through relating to a perception of how things are together.
It's kind of shimmering on my retina.
I had the feeling like it is common, but it is an unknown common, unknown. This sense of intending, the dual sense of having directed one's attention to. So intend to direct one's attention, literally to stretch out towards.
The interplay of orientation and disorientation, the dynamic or the navigation or the negotiation that was happening between these forces.
This kind of lively lightness, a quality of lightness.
Supported by something, like a kind of thinking that is supported by something or carried by something or taken along in a way. What supports or carries the thinking doing?
Again, the flight of thought, a sense of when you notice it going into thought. Does it really have to go into thought?
Carried or taken or moved by a momentum that I am not fully in control of somehow, like a breeze.
Why can I not just stay with it?
Space. Circling.
Question.
Head first.
Clear.
Merging.
Practicing.
Letting the relation happen or letting the connection happen. This relation between the moment to receive something and the moment where I actively move into. What do I allow to be? What do I allow to happen? What does it mean to hold back?
Recognizing what that habit does in terms of being open to the range of possibilities that experience brings.
It happens again and again and again, and it deepens. It helps to, it happens.
I am making a decision. I am making a decision to keep existing one mode of encounter through preference of another mode of encounter.
A kind of interweaving of emergence between the different parts are coming together, but not through association. This mutual emergence, each creating the conditions for the other.
How do you modify the frame implicitly? This correspondence between language and the I.
There is a coming alive in the moment that creates conditions for thinking somehow, releasing and at the same time arising, a release into and something that is uprising.
Bottom,
Being,
foundation,
allowed,
surface,
moving,
focus,
zones. Accepting. The gentleness allowed you to be, or allowed the constitution of the gentleness. The constitution of the gentleness allowed the being there.
How are my senses mobilized in order to constitute this sphere?
To not intend, to unbind, to untie, unfasten, to uncongeal, to unfreeze, to loosen, relax, collapse. This sense of holding back in order to let something emerge, holding back something, holding back.
What is the vibrating body and where is the sound?
There is a movement into continuity. There are different types of engagement of the eyes and how the eyes work in relation to the common or the mutual, or how that co-constitutes the common and the mutual that acts.
Protected,
Continue,
distractions,
choosing,
hand,
sphere,
intense connection,
a different kind of thoughtful thinking. Action process starts and it couples back.
then coming back to a stiller sense.
The removal of something or the shifting of something that suddenly brings the background into the fore, or the periphery somehow into a more focused attention.
An excitement that happens on a very subtle but very present in a way.
The indirectness of this thinking.
The excitement that starts to happen when there are possibilities that are actualized.
A kind of momentum between a grounding experience, a
Then
settling
different
experience.
processes.
A few moments in that experience where the edge was much more soft.
It is really something that grounds in the same way.
becoming aware of, coming into connection with, getting in touch with. What is this moment of happening? Where do I shift? Where is the shift happening?
This relationship
This is a condition of a certain kind of thinking.
receive something and move into. It is really relation.
Variety, touch, alternative,
Articulation,
separation,
possibility,
dynamic,
rearranging,
participating,
accepting, proceed,
same, needs, curiosity,
self-modulating,
zones,
emergences,
care,
care as an intrinsic part of partaking,
without,
without deciding,
mutual care,
appearing,
mutedly,
dynamic, contact,
without,
identity,
continuously,
fundamentally,
confirmation,
transformative,
beyond the borders,
expression,
action,
influence,
careful attention,
without deciding, without cutting up,
clearly, steadily,
an emergence of the mutual conditioning of the participants,
a field of resonances,
immanent, spontaneous, emergent, distributed,
vibrant matters,
something not reducible,
careful variation of frequencies, attentive, resonant,
contact,
co-vibrating,
connection,
tentative, attentive,
in touch, intact,
sense of,
taking apart,
as the proceeding of thinking,
intimate relations,
always apart,
in touch,
retreating,
pull apart,
through surrendering,
partaking,
acceptance,
contact,
deciding, a decided self,
a touch without direct consequences,
a selfless self,
a transformative but not transcendent difference, parts appearing to themselves,
articulation of the whole,
an expression of the dynamic articulation of the parts without expressing their singularities, but something else.
different, transformative, not transcendent,
Without cutting up,
through,
particularity,
of the articulation, of the contingency,
something else.
being the same, being the same,
Appearing, disclosing themselves, appearing to themselves,
questioning identity,
participating in the fluidity, underlying any discontinuity, any difference,
contact, of touch,
closer to communication, to make common,
connection, connected,
separation. Separation is a condition for joining, for rejoining, for being in touch.
simultaneously, separate,
Contact,
reorganization of the common,
separation as preparation, creating the conditions for reconnection, reorganization of the common.
tactful with tact,
Taking apart,
with touch, in tact,
taking part,
state of being intact, not intact,
taking a part,
unsettling,
partaking,
again, part-taking, taking apart,
towards taking apart, destabilization of an illusory whole, the whole that actually separates and divides. Separation as disconnection, as a cutting off from the continuum.
no touch,
Deciding,
participation, not departing thus from establishing contact,
with tact, sensitive to feeling discernment in action or in conduct, tactful, with tact,
no begin thus again now referring to time, between past and present,
a state of being intact, not intact,
constant and complex rearrangement,
contact,
carefully,
constitutes,
without will-based,
not irreducible,
a care without intention,
not additional,
arising, occurring from sensing,
endowed with the agency of co-constituting presences for themselves,
without reasons, without motivations, without targets, without explanations, without justifications,
without a deciding, undecided self,
expression,
as an emergence of the mutual,
sense of self, of a porously, subtly delimited self,
something not reducible, reconnection,
a variety of action,
reorganization,
careful,
contact,
sensible action, noticing,
separation,
attending, and self-modulating,
reorganization of the common,
oscillating,
making ready,
influencing the joinings of the joint parts and furthermore their vibrant matters,
simultaneously joining and separating, joining through separating,
as an attentive participation,
with tact,
bringing forth,
with touch, through taking apart,
purposiveness,
different but not additional, a transformative but not transcendent difference,
participation, something else,
difference as transformative disclosure,
through
through in both senses,
relation, appearing,
disappearing,
agency of co-constituting,
a certain possibility of being the same,
extend,
breaking continuity,
maybe maintaining certain identity, certain possibility of being the same, of continuing being the same,
questioning the identity of the operability of the selves and their presence, or maybe better, more fundamentally, participating in the fluidity underlying any discontinuity, any difference.
make connection, act of connecting, circle of relations,
Contact, the state or condition of touching,
simultaneously,
closer to communication, to make common,
and partire,
contact with touch.
Separation as preparation. Reorganization.
Articulation. Continuity.
With touch, in touch.
Co-constituting.
A state of being intact.
Enabling parts and the whole to appear to themselves anew.
Stabilizes.
Without expressing their singularities, but something else.
Separation.
An emergence of mutual conditioning.
For restoring a sense of dynamic wholeness, a wholeness that is intact, not intact.
A juxtaposition that also constitutes contact.
Alternatively,
A touch without direct consequences.
therefore,
Depending on the direction.
and as.
To establish relationship, to bring together.
Variation. Of.
Possibility.
To.
With tact. Tactful.
The same body. A body as part. A body as subtly, porously demarcated zone.
Full of, having, characteristic of touch, with touch, intact.
Variations of its environments.
A state of being intact, not intact.
Becoming place in a different way.
The presences of the other.
Conscious intentionally.
Separation as preparation. Creating the conditions for reconnection, reorganization of the common.
Without end.
Reconnecting with the continuum, taking apart and rejoining as a way of reorganization, reorganizing through joining and taking apart.
Any other presence than the sensing itself.
The eye is touched by the mutual recognition of a neighboring mediation as a testimony to the other, of the non-self, of the counterpart.
Extended sense of self.
Towards taking apart. Destabilization of an illusory whole, the whole that actually separates and divides, the sense of the self as separate, as self-contained.
Of being.
Separation as disconnection, as a cutting off from the continuum, the cut of naming into parts.
A variety of action. Careful.
Add this and this, a that and that.
An articulated continuum.
To pull apart.
What happens, what appears, what emerges in and through the dynamic articulation of the extended.
Apartness.
The articulation of minimal.
Perpetual reorganization, endless continuum of joining and taking apart.
A network. A field. Violently. Intimately influencing the joinings of the joined parts and furthermore their vibrant matters.
Impart, into, in, and partire, to divide, to part, to partake, to have a part in.
Participation.
to pull apart. Separation as preparation.
And with proposing, placing, place.
Perception.
Place, not in the sense of where thinking happens, but rather as the proceeding of thinking.
Common.
Oscillation.
Deciding.
Moving. Selfless. Self.
Making ready for
And
apartness.
whole. The parts nor the whole.
So in the live exploration or presentation that you've just witnessed, we wanted to foreground the actual practicing of aesthetic research practices within an ecology of action. So now, in order to initiate a dialogue, we want to outline briefly the working hypothesis that served as the initial impulse for our shared inquiry, alongside some of the emergent questions that we're exploring. So thinking aesthetic thinking is an ongoing collaborative research inquiry initiated on the basis of 4 working hypotheses. Firstly, aesthetic research practices systematize forms of preeminently sensory, motor, and emotional action, which are neither target audience oriented nor will-based. Secondly, aesthetic action enables and intensifies immediate and unmediated interactions between researchers and the inquired issues, co-constituting a field of non-hierarchical shared relations. Thirdly, aesthetic interaction conditions the ongoing processes of sense-making between researchers and the inquired issues, with the agency of destabilizing the habitualized forms and meanings within which these issues appear. And fourthly, on this basis, aesthetic thinking allows for disclosing new intelligibilities of the researched issues. That is, it enables the potentialities of radically new understandings to arise. So whilst we've been geographically distanced, we found new ways of sharing practices within an online environment for exploring the potential of both being together and also being apart, for harnessing the media specificity of online technologies as a site of aesthetic inquiry. And through this process of shared exploration, further questions have emerged in relation to 4 interrelated foci. So I'm going to share those now. So first, practices. What do specific aesthetic research practices enable or enhance? How do specific aesthetic research practices enable or enhance aesthetic thinking? And what kinds of practices can be developed, tested, and shared? 2, ecologies. How does the coexistence, coinciding, and mutual conditioning of different practices enable or enhance aesthetic thinking? So here, exploring connectivity and collectivity, how might we bring different practices into relation? Thirdly, conditions. What are the conditions for aesthetic thinking, and how might these conditions be nurtured? What enables or supports the emergence of conditions for aesthetic thinking, and what inhibits or limits the emergence of such conditions? And then finally, agencies. Who or what is the agent of aesthetic thinking? So far, our investigation has proceeded in and through practice, or rather through specific aesthetic research practices. But today, within the frame of this conference, we're very interested in opening up a wider dialogue between philosophical aesthetics and aesthetic research. And we're really delighted and excited about engaging with a conversation with you now. So thank you. Yeah, so we've invited you all in, I think now, to the webinar room, and are very happy to take responses. You might want to, unmute your video, or use the raised hand function, or post comments in the chat. All of these are very welcome.
Samuel, if you're there, then you could open the chat now, so I can.
Yeah, the chat is open for everyone. Every
Great.
person can post in the chat or unmute
Fantastic.
video.
Thank you.
The chat is open, but as Emma said, also, like, we are very, very interested in entering in dialogue with you. we have intended with this ecology of research, practice, and action, as we said at the beginning, to provide evidences in so literal terms of evidences, bring something to appear of what can or could be aesthetic thinking. We are really curious about the resonance of this work and the resonance of this investigation for you. So please don't be shy and just break the ice wherever you find a fissure.
I'm going to try and post some of the questions also in the chat that we have started to, I suppose, that have really emerged through the doing of this practice, kind of questions or foci that may not necessarily have been there at the start of our collaboration together, but have really begun to emerge as we've been working. So I'll post those in the chat. I mean, maybe also there's a different way of approaching it, which I suppose is to say something about opening up a space of interest in aesthetic thinking, which I guess those of you that are here are interested in, you know, from making a choice of panel. And I think Alex was saying, I wasn't able to attend this myself, I'm not a German speaker, but Dieter, I know, was referring to this very much in his opening introduction also, as a kind of a field of practice. Maybe nobody is there. Maybe they all disappear, right?
Maybe.
My name is Crosby. Let's see.
Hello, hello.
Hello. Hello.
Hi, Crosby.
Hello.
And nice to see you.
Nice to see you. I'm just starting just because of the just because to break the silence, but not because I have something truly. I missed the beginning, so I'm very sorry about that. So this helps me, but I was able to witness a chunk of it or be with you, and that was extremely exciting because one thing I noticed is that I had a question about the limits of the zoom, meaning about the order of the images, because I had urge to play, I guess, and to somehow interact or move something myself, but not because I felt like anything new needed to be, new visual or auditory needed to be offered, but so I thought it's a curious question about the conditions, because what does inspire somebody to want to, what fuels somebody, so how much of it is a participatory urge and how much is an appreciation or inspiration. So I found myself curious about that, and yeah, I'm very sorry I missed the beginning, so said enough.
No worries. I mean, I really very much appreciate your question, and also like your impulse to participate. I mean, we had to make some decisions after knowing that the conference was not going to be in Zurich. So we have been working for at least 6 months with this hypothesis that we will have a room during the 3 days of the conference in Zurich. And this will be, of course, it would open other possibilities of interactions. And so we have to rethink everything and to kind of pack our plans in a 2 hours Zoom session. What I found interesting, what you were saying, was like also like the possibility of recognizing a thread of I would say of a thread of thought, and therefore the possibility of becoming part of it, without us giving any explanations about it. I mean, in the exposition of the research catalog in which we are presenting this project, for us as a kind of also as a container, as an archive of our work. And I think Emma wanted to also to share this link with you. I mean, another different link that one we provided for the conference, which was a very preliminary one. Here we are. I lost my thread. Yeah, exactly. So there is also a section in which we also share the scores of the practices we have been practicing. Yeah. And of course, to read a score provides also possibilities of engaging operatively with the practice. The very interesting and exciting thing is that without you having read the score, so you were able to, and I recognize already the motivation, the ability to participate in that. You know? And I think this is an aspect that is also has been also very, very relevant for us in this aspect of this aesthetic thinking as always collective thinking. So in the framework of aesthetic thinking, I would say that the possibility of a unique and isolated agent of thought is absolutely excluded. Which, yeah.
Yeah, I felt like the bridges or the connections that one makes in one's own mind and is part of a shared space. So it's quite exciting to share that, knowing that other connections and other thoughts are being opened up.
And I think in some of the spoken components that we were sharing, also this notion of participation, partaking, taking apart, taking apart was also very present. And in that sense, maybe one of, as Alex is saying, one of the observations that we've been making in and through the practice is this sense of or quality of participation as a characteristic or quality of a certain kind of aesthetic thinking, perhaps. I mean, maybe part of that research further would be to sort of dig deeper, to kind of delve into how is that quality of participation, how is participation as a condition of aesthetic thinking even. This could be quite an interesting question to kind of flip it around with. But I think also the key thing in our work so far, I think, is also the doing of it through the practice itself.
And yet there was your question also of the limits of Zoom, no? And I think in our presumption that we had to give up at a certain point that we will not be in a physical space with people present, there's also the question of not only the partaking of you, but us kind of partaking of you, right? And I think there in the Zoom there is a limit to the Zoom that we didn't explore so far, in how far that can also be, your partaking can also be a co-constitutive of our practice. So where it's there overlapping, or where you can, as you said, the impulse to play or to shift things or to, I see it as movement, or I understood it as movement impulses through the Zoom interface. I think this is definitely something to be explored.
But in terms of Zoom, there was also this interesting thing. I mean, maybe this also relates to this question from KB about, during the research, have you noticed what is not aesthetic sorry, during your research, have you noticed what is not thinking aesthetic thinking to you? And maybe one connection to that, I might kind of draw in sort of as a bit of a segue into that question, is that we've only been working on this collaboration during the conditions of the last year, let's say, during which all of our meetings and connections have been taking place using online platforms, whether that's Skype or more recently Zoom. And then initially you could say, I think we were using those platforms in a relatively utilitarian way. We were using them for our meetings, and it was a vehicle through which to meet and talk. And yet there was a moment, actually there was a moment that coincided with us not being able to share through physical proximity with you in Zurich. Something then happened that enabled Zoom to open up as a potential platform to be used in different kinds of ways. And in a sense, at that point, I think was when we really began to investigate it as, I mean, perhaps a kind of collaborator is a bit too far-fetched, but certainly as a way of enabling certain connections and resonances to happen between our practices, which could not happen in any other way. So the fact of us practicing in different cities internationally and yet co-producing or bringing these practices into correspondence in real time, sound and image and overlapping of materials. Somehow there's something very interesting in how that technology actually became a facilitating partner in that inquiry, and actually I think enabled a different inquiry to emerge, which may not have done in other circumstances, in a sense. So the role of the media in this, I think, is actually very intriguing. And I deviated, sorry, from this question of what have we have we noticed what is not thinking aesthetic thinking within our own research?
Yeah, but I think I can bridge what you were saying with this question and bridge it back, because you already referred to it. Personally, I think in terms of I think aesthetic thinking in terms of a way of interaction and preparing this session. Yeah, so there was, for example, it's an example, moments in when we were noticing and saying to each other, we are shifting to a producing mode. Yeah, and like in small details, also of course recalling habits that we all have because we are all trained as artists, and then also thinking, for example, oh, will be better to have this image or to appear in with 5 or 4 squares and so on. And there was this alarm saying, oh, we're abandoning aesthetic thinking, and we are going into another mode of interaction with ourselves, with our cooperation, with our collaboration with the medium, in terms of producing something for others. Yeah, and I think this is an example of moments in which we were noticing that we were coming closer to the boundary that differentiates aesthetic thinking from other forms of other varieties of thinking. Yeah, we don't have a catalog of these varieties, but because we were kind of working from the inside, from the immanency of this kind of thinking. But yes, I think I think it really is absolutely easy to bodily notice the activation of other varieties of thinking.
I mean, maybe I could sort of say something about that felt sense, actually. I mean, in some ways, it also arises in the coming into a space of conference, actually, that that kind of, again, what you may have noticed in some of the textual components, quite often there's this description of spaciousness and a space expanding, or the sense of something opening up or emerging. And I think certainly in my own experience, I think experience which is common, the shift from the quality of thinking that emerges from that sense of spaciousness, actually that sense of participation within the wider field of agencies. I think the felt sense of it is very tangible as contraction, actually. The felt sense of contraction or shrinkage or tightening or grasping. Actually, I think this grasping recurred over and over. And I suppose, yeah, what might that grasping be? Sometimes I think the grasping manifests as a kind of fixing, in particular, the sense which emerged over and over, I think many times, of trying to bring into language something that was operating on a completely, no, not on a completely different register, the level of the medium, but on a different register of attitude or disposition. This bringing into language, I think, was definitely shifting. Also, this threshold that Alex is also talking about, I think, was there in this attempt to somehow bring or force or grasp or control. And again, I think the quality of that is a closing in, a kind of closing in on something. My train of thought went a little bit there. There were other examples, I think, which was to do with that kind of, the tightening up, I think, also happens at this threshold where you reach the limit of, reach a kind of an unknown. And sometimes that's the limits of your own habits and conventions and ways of doing things, or the limits of your own comfort, actually. And I think there's a real opportunity at that threshold where you either let go into it and see what arises, or you close down around it as protection. And again, I think anyone who works in collaboration knows that that threshold is very fragile and precarious, and it's quite easy to go one way or the other. But I think the hope in aesthetic thinking terms is that the impulse that is followed is to expand and not to contract back into already existing and known ways of doing things.
Mm.
Oh, we're really happy to hear also. I mean, of course, we haven't said it, so we are talking about the dialogue, but this dialogue can also be, for sure, based on critical comments about also the strategies. Also, we use also to do what we have done, and also to be here in this conference following these strategies. So we knew from the very beginning that this was going to be, that we were going to take a radical way. Also a strategy of not talking about aesthetic thinking, or not reflecting on or upon or about aesthetic thinking, but doing what the title of the section expresses, which is thinking aesthetic thinking through aesthetic research practices. This was a strategy. So, and I will be also very happy to hear your comments also in this regard. Was this the right way? I mean, or was this at least an appropriate way? And another question that also occupies us a lot is, or the specification of this last question is, was this a right way to enter in a dialogue? In this case, mainly with philosophers.
Actually, maybe I add another question in that, which is also this question of through what means or how might we open dialogue in a way that stays with or remains in continuity to the aesthetic thinking that we were practicing within the ecology. I mean, certainly conversation has formed part of the practices that we've tested, but really, I think within the frame of our collaboration, this is the first time that we open up to a in this kind of way, let's say, to a discussion with other people. So there is that interesting question of, yeah, what happens actually in that shift between the experience of engaging with an exploration presentation to then this space of dialogue. Yeah, how might we even collectively continue the aesthetic, anesthetic mode of thinking within that? Is it possible to do that even?
Although does not mean that you should be forced or restrained by this comment. I mean, feel free to talk also in your own terms, you know, for sure. I mean, a dialogue implies this, right? This difference also as a possibility.
You can also post things in the chat. It might also be just something that you want to hear more about, or
maybe I can say or share something in my experience, and also relating maybe to the question of what is thinking, aesthetic thinking, and not. And regarding that, I cannot, after practicing for now quite a while in this ecology or in our collective field, I still cannot say exactly what is the difference between thinking aesthetic or not thinking aesthetic. I mean, this is still a question that occurs to me. And also today in the practice, for me, it is more an inclusive way of thinking. I think it has to do with becoming aware of all things that are happening. And as we were developing our practice together, we started from very simple practice. Everybody of us brought in different kind of practices, and that was an interesting experience. Also, doing a practice that is not something where I'm in a way professional in, and doing someone else's practice, for example, language-based practice, but still coming into an aesthetic mode with that and not knowing what it actually is. And it is an interesting process to me to go into the shared practices and see what can be discovered in there, in also in relation to what I would call my comfort zone. What does it make? How does it influence that in reflection or in giving impulses back and forth? And so for today, I can definitely say that I would say I was in aesthetic mode by practicing together, even in the preparation, I would say, because the way we collaborated is very, I would say, very precise and very careful and very, we've been talking about also in our text about the careful. Of course, there we had the clear intention to do this this Zoom conference or the Zoom webinar, which gave a specific frame, but yet working with that and having made decisions that was the result we just experienced. And I'm sure we could go further on, even in the question, I think Sabine, you mentioned before about the question, how can we even open up a practice to be shared within a media like Zoom? That would be quite interesting to discover and see if there is a possibility to open it up, because that was mainly our first impulse that when we were thinking about the conference, doing it in Zurich. So right now, what we are trying to do here is sharing something and sharing and opening. And I think the ecology we created is trying to open, or trying to create resonance fields, but they can only be, in my experience, when I always go freshly into the experience itself. So maybe I could say there were moments where I realized, okay, I'm here in my habits, and I'm kind of in the comfort zone, and am I able to go further, even if we are live at the moment? And I can say, yeah, I really experienced that, and it is also a very enriching experience to practice in different places together at the same time, simultaneously, and knowing we are all there, we are all in the focus at the moment. And yeah.
In relation to the thing you said about habits, there's a nice question here in the chat again from KB that says, I'd be very curious to hear how your practices might have changed by working on this project. Did you see or feel an impact?
Yeah, I definitely. I mean, for me, it was a great shift that we were using the Zoom moment when we know we had to prepare everything online as our contribution to this conference. There, we started to think about how do we build the ecologies together? How do we place the practices together? How do we connect them? What we did before, more one phase after another. So we were connecting it differently, and with that experience and the more multi-layered moments, I discovered, for me, I mean, my main practice I would say is the drawing practice, and this moment of observing myself while I draw. I mean, I did that many times before, but I think this was something that gave me the possibility also to think about the comfort zones or the habits that I had. And also in this repetitional practice we did, because also with the score that Sabine brought in, I could realize, what do we do when we do something more often than one time, and how do we enter and how do we experience it every time new? So it definitely, I would say, there is the option of reflecting the habits while or because of working together. Yeah.
I can maybe also answer something shortly to that question, which goes back to the beginning, actually, when we started to work, which was already online and in different places. So even if we wanted to, we wouldn't have been able to meet. I proposed a practice, which is a movement practice outdoors in the city, so that everybody did by themselves in a different place, in a different time at that time even. And for me, like, there were two things that I realized very strongly in that first moment that changed, because what we did was we basically everyone practiced that on their own, and then we had our meetings. And in the meeting, there was another practice, language-based practice from Emma proposed, that we then based on the experiences through the other practice. So there was the start of working alongside and connected to each other, and connecting practices in this way. For me, was extremely interesting, because I realized, first of all, that this one score that I proposed has actually many different aspects that through the media also I couldn't transmit, and aspects that I obviously transmit usually when I work like this, or when I work with people. I transmit them through many things I set up in advance. So I kind of create a context and I create a way of feedbacking, and from that we go back into practice. And all of that wasn't possible, but somehow there was another context growing, not only through the media and through collaboration, but through this very specific coupling of practices. And the other type of language-based practice that Emma then brought in, which is very different from how I would have done it, changed back folky in the practice itself. I could go in what that means, but it did change a lot in this coupling and through not being able to create all that physical and analog and special context all around it.
There is also another question in the chat, which is, I would say, one of the hard questions. The question is, how did your sense of time influence the experience of aesthetic thinking?
I think actually I would say it almost goes the other way. How did the experience of aesthetic thinking influence the sense of time? I think is also a different way. I mean, it's a different question, but it
I think this is a question, and also like the tendency, so that this inversion you made, Emma, that I was also so spontaneously moved to make. Yeah. So I think both the question and our spontaneous tendency to invert the question, I think they touch on a point that for me is absolutely fundamental, which is that I consider aesthetic thinking to be a fundamentally transformative thinking. And I think in this, I mean, the way time or the experience of time is affected by the agency of this thinking. I think this is clear for us. So it is a way of thinking that creates, I would say, its own chronological conditions. If a minimal chronological conditions are provided, which, for example, I consider that is as a kind of a starting chronological conditions to depart from a non-tensed time, so a time which is not set in a grid. This is a differentiation that was made commonly in the music that Pierre Boulez, for example, was making as a kind of two different musical times. And I think this time out of the grid is a time that enables a transformation of the experience of time, or a transformation of time as experience through aesthetic thinking. You know what I said? I didn't answer the question.
Actually, I noticed
I was getting around. Yeah.
I think XB, who's the person who asked the question, has also put their hand up. So maybe they also want to.
Please.
I don't know how to get my hand down. Okay, good. I can get it down. Because even when the person answers, I don't know what. Okay.
I can do it. I have the power.
Somebody else can get it. I just experimenting with your race. I was thinking about what was said about the carefulness, and I felt that in a sense of time, as well as there a carefulness about giving time, and in a way that you all were talking before on this panel about space, space opening up. I felt there was a time opening up in a similar way. So I didn't know if that was it's just a question. So I didn't know how much that's like the chicken egg question, which one causes it, to the aesthetic thinking, like you were talking, opening that, or whether it was noticed happening or whether it was intended or as a part of a process that's been initiated between, like Sabine was saying before, the coupling of your practices. So I don't know. So, but I do appreciate that answer. It was probably better than the question. Okay.
For sure not, but I mean this issue of the of what is causing what is consequence, also in the question of intention. It was for sure, this can I answer directly, it was for sure not our intention, because we didn't have any kind of intention in this regard. Yeah. So if I said, and I continue thinking, that aesthetic thinking is fundamentally a transformative way of thinking, I think this transformation is an open-ended one. So the even transformation is not intended, but it is intrinsic, and probably this is always the case. But time and thinking are there the whole time, and probably there is always a mutual influence between the experience of time and the modality of thinking which is being performed. Yeah. So I think this would be a way in order to, so a kind of a category maybe that would help also to specify, or to specify differences between aesthetic thinking and other forms of thinking.
Mm.
I think we reached already our time limit. I wonder if there is any other questions or any other comments. As I said, critical comments are very welcome. That you want to make as a closing question, closing statements.
I think I would actually just also like to say thank you all for attending to this, because I think it's a very particular format and an experimental format, and requires a certain, or invites a certain kind of attention. And yeah, I just feel very appreciative for staying with us on that. Margarita is raising her hand.
Yes, please.
For last comment. For me, it was a kind of reduction or minimalism, and therefore it enhanced the thinking, because there are different levels. It also was an acceleration on the level of time. It was a reduction in using the language, and it was very, let's say, in a slow motion. The gestures, the artistic gestures were presented in a very slow motion. Also, the speech was very slow, and therefore it helped to feel familiar with what you want to transmit. And I'm from the architectural, I'm looking at it from an architectural and design research point of view, but I felt very familiar, and also thought it's my habit. And therefore I think it's right to say it's something we have in common, or there is a common ground in this point, but it also depends on the way you presented it. And I very much enjoyed this, the layering of the different medias. Mm-hmm. And I think this is not so easy if we have, if it would have been taking place in Zurich. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is a possibility of the Zoom meeting, to have these things synchronically. Mm-hmm. So thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you also for pointing to this common ground of aesthetic research, or aesthetic thinking, and design and architectural thinking. Thank you very much for that.
Mhm.
I guess we have to, if there are no other comments or questions, I have to close here the panel. So I will reinforce what Emma said, and thank you so much for being with us. Please visit our exposition and the research catalog, and please let's keep in touch. Let's keep thinking aesthetic thinking collectively. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.